Welcome, dear listener, to a tale woven from quiet lanes, rose-draped cottages, and the gentle gossip of an English village where secrets bloom as readily as lavender in midsummer. Settle in with a cup of tea, for you are about to step into a world where the ordinary hides the extraordinary. Picture yourself wandering down a shaded garden path at dusk, the air scented with honeysuckle, when suddenly you pause. Have you ever walked through a garden at twilight and felt as though it were keeping a secret from you? Tell me, what would you have done? Let's begin Miss Marple and the Whispering Garden. Chapter 1. A Summer Afternoon. It was one of those golden afternoons when the English countryside seems to hold its breath in lazy contentment, as though the very air had steeped too long in sunshine. The hedgerows bordering the narrow lane leading into St. Mary Mead were heavy with late roses and the faint tang of ripening blackberries. Bees hummed industriously, weaving invisible patterns from blossom to blossom, and somewhere in the distance a church bell struck 4, its mellow tone carrying across the fields like a quiet reminder of time's steady passing. Miss Jane Marple, small and unassuming in her neat straw hat and light summer frock, alighted from the motor coach with the air of one who belonged here as naturally as the ivy clinging to the stone cottages. To the casual eye she was merely another elderly spinster returning home with a modest handbag and sensible shoes. But those who knew her would have recognized the shrewd sparkle behind her pale blue eyes, an observant gaze that never failed to notice what others dismissed as trivial. The village itself appeared drowsy, wrapped in the languor of the season. Mrs. Bantry's gardener was clipping a hedge outside Gossington Hall, pausing now and again to wipe his brow with a checked kerchief. A cluster of children played marbles in the dust near the green, their shrill laughter mingling with the cooing of wood pigeons. On the steps of the post office, Mrs. Hartnell fanned herself with a folded newspaper, her sharp eyes scanning the lane in search of conversation, or better still, gossip. Everywhere Miss Marple looked, there was charm, comfort, and the soothing rhythm of village life. Yet beneath the painted shutters and well-tended gardens, she could not help but sense, as she often did, the quiet pulse of something more, unspoken resentments, whispered rumours, the small human follies that, like weeds in a flower bed, had a way of sprouting where least expected. She paused at the gate of her own ivy-covered cottage, inhaling the fragrance of lavender that lined the path. The sound of bees seemed louder here, the air thicker with their humming industry. Setting her bag upon the gate-post for a moment, she smiled faintly, reflecting that even the busiest of bees might miss a flower or two, just as the most careful of neighbours might fail to notice certain things, unless, of course, one knew precisely where to look. As she pushed open the wooden gate and stepped onto the gravel, a faint rustle came from the adjoining garden of Mrs. Price Ridley. The formidable widow herself appeared a moment later, tall and angular, adjusting her sun hat. "Back from London, Miss Marple?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral but her eyes bright with curiosity. "Yes, only this afternoon," Miss Marple replied pleasantly. She noted the faint tremor in the widow's hands as she fussed with her gloves, and stored the observation quietly away. For in villages such as St. Mary Mead, even the smallest detail, an anxious glance, a hurried word, could be the beginning of a mystery yet untold. The village green of St. Mary Mead was never so lively as on a fine summer's afternoon, when the shade of the great chestnut tree offered respite from the sun and the benches beneath became a natural stage for the comings and goings of village life. It was here that Miss Marple found herself not long after arriving, drawn as much by habit as by curiosity. for it was common knowledge that if one wished to hear the pulse of the village, its little triumphs, its quiet scandals, and its endless conjectures, this was the place to linger. Mrs. Hartnell was already there, of course, in her usual position like a watchful sentinel. Plump, red-cheeked, and perpetually fanning herself with whatever scrap of paper came to hand, she had the air of one who considered it her duty to keep St. Mary Mead properly informed. At her side sat the vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, who listened with a polite smile, interjecting a gentle word now and again as though she might tame the more extravagant claims of her companion. Across the way, Mr. Petherick the solicitor leaned upon his cane, exchanging pleasantries with Dr. Haydock, who, in his brisk manner, seemed perpetually impatient even when he had nowhere particular to be. A pair of maids from the hall strolled by, their aprons crisp and their laughter bubbling, casting furtive glances at the young constable who pretended to study the notice-board but looked up at every opportunity. Miss Marple settled herself unobtrusively at the edge of the group, her knitting bag in hand. Needles clicked softly, though her eyes were not always on the yarn. Instead, she let her gaze wander, catching small moments that others missed. The way Mrs. Hartnell's voice dropped ever so slightly when mentioning Colonel Melshay's late-night return from the neighbouring town, or how Mr. Petherick cleared his throat rather pointedly when the subject of a certain will was raised. It was harmless chatter, to be sure, the sort that drifted like smoke and often vanished with the next breeze. Yet to Miss Marple it was more than idle amusement. Each remark was a thread, faint perhaps, but capable of weaving into a larger pattern if one only paid attention. She had long ago learned that human nature, whether in grand London drawing-rooms or sleepy village lanes, tended to repeat itself. And where repetition lay, so too did truth. A sudden burst of laughter came from the maids again, drawing Mrs. Hartnell's sharp rebuke. Flirting in broad daylight. Standards simply aren't what they were. She sniffed, though her eyes twinkled with relish at the impropriety. Miss Marple allowed herself the faintest of smiles. Villages, she reflected, had their dramas, small to the world, but of enormous significance to those within. And sometimes, within these seemingly trifling matters, lay the seed of something far less innocent. As the church bell chimed the half-hour, Miss Marple gathered her knitting, her mind quietly at work. Somewhere among these familiar faces, she felt, a story was beginning to unfold, though no one else yet realized it. Chapter 2. Garden Party Invitation. The announcement came, as such things often did, in the most casual of fashions, over tea poured in delicate porcelain cups at Mrs. Clement's drawing-room. Word drifted out that Lady Chatterton, recently returned from a lengthy stay with her sister in Bath, intended to host a grand garden party at the manor. It would be, Mrs. Clement assured everyone, quite the affair, with strawberries, music, and even a fortune-teller, if the rumours are to be believed. At once, excitement fluttered across St. Mary Mead as though a breeze had stirred the lace curtains of every cottage window. Garden parties were not uncommon in summer, but one at the manor carried a certain weight. It was an opportunity to be seen, to exchange tidbits of gossip, and to measure, with discreet glances, who was prospering and who was quietly slipping down life's ladder. Mrs. Hartnell, for her part, declared she had nothing suitable to wear and would simply have to speak to the dressmaker, though her eyes gleamed with anticipation. Dr. Haydock grumbled about wasted afternoons and frivolity, but no one doubted he would attend, if only to observe his patients at their merriest. Even young Constable Davies, still pretending indifference, was heard inquiring after the time of the event as though he might, quite coincidentally, find himself off duty that very afternoon. Miss Marple listened with a pleasant smile, fingers busily working at her knitting. She had been to many such gatherings over the years, and she knew that the entertainment was often secondary to the quiet revelations they produced. People, when distracted by music and merriment, let down their guard. Words were spoken in jest that might not otherwise be uttered, glances exchanged that could betray far more than their owners intended. And already there were hints of something curious. Mrs. Price Ridley, who prided herself on being invited to all the right events, muttered that her envelope had yet to arrive, though Mrs. Clement insisted the invitations had been posted the previous week. Mr. Petherick remarked, with studied nonchalance, that he had heard Lady Chatterton's finances were not quite so robust as she liked to suggest. Could such a lavish affair be a little too ambitious? It was all very ordinary, to be sure, but to Miss Marple's sharp ears, the ordinary was precisely where the extraordinary liked to hide. Why, for instance, did Mrs. Price Ridley flush so deeply at the mention of the missing invitation? And why did Mrs. Clement, so usually calm, glance quickly away when pressed on the guest list? Such things might amount to nothing, and yet, more often than not, they did not. As she sipped her tea, Miss Marple thought how curious it was that in villages, secrets were like wildflowers, scattered freely, some bright and harmless, others poisonous if touched. The garden party would be the perfect ground in which such secrets might bloom. The clock on the mantel chimed the hour, and the chatter resumed with renewed energy. But in the quiet click of her knitting needles, Miss Marple was already preparing herself. Something told her that this garden party would prove far more interesting than anyone expected. The afternoon of the garden party arrived in a blaze of sunlight, the kind of golden warmth that seemed almost too perfect for an English summer. St. Mary Mead's narrow lanes bustled with villagers dressed in their Sunday best, parasols unfurled, and hats adorned with flowers and feathers bobbing merrily as their wearers made their way toward Chatterton Manor. The manor itself looked splendid. Its ivy-clad walls gleamed in the light, and Lady Chatterton's gardeners had laboured to perfection. Roses spilled in riotous bloom, and neat rows of lavender released their fragrance as guests strolled past. Tables had been set upon the lawn, draped in crisp white cloths, each holding trays of delicate sandwiches, sugared scones, and bowls piled high with strawberries glistening like jewels. A string quartet played lightly beneath a striped marquee, their music carrying on the breeze. It was, in every sense, a scene of picturesque delight. Yet beneath the laughter and chatter, Miss Marple could sense undercurrents. She noticed, for example, how Mrs. Price Ridley swept past Lady Chatterton with only the briefest of nods, her lips pressed thin. A trifle rude, certainly, and yet not entirely without reason, for Lady Chatterton's smile, though wide, did not reach her eyes. Clusters of villagers formed and reformed across the lawn, like dancers shifting partners. Mrs. Hartnell was already recounting, in tones far too loud, how the local butcher had been short on cuts of lamb that week, while the vicar's wife leaned in to whisper something scandalous to the schoolmistress. Dr. Haydock, balancing a plate and a glass of punch, stood apart, observing everyone with the same clinical detachment he might bring to his patients. Miss Marple, quietly sipping her tea from a china cup, allowed her gaze to wander. A garden party, she often thought, was a curious theatre in which the whole village performed its roles. One only had to watch carefully to see which actors were out of step. And there were oddities indeed. A gentleman unknown to most had arrived, a tall man in a dark suit far too warm for the season. He spoke little, offering curt nods, and lingered near the edge of the gathering as though seeking someone or avoiding them. When Miss Marple asked Mrs. Clement who he might be, the vicar's wife hesitated. "Oh, a cousin of Lady Chatterton's, I believe. From London." Her tone suggested she herself was not entirely certain. Meanwhile, laughter broke out near the marquee. The fortune-teller, a rosy-cheeked woman in a shawl, had begun drawing cards for eager villagers. Some treated it as a joke, others leaned in with earnest curiosity. Miss Marple noticed how Lady Chatterton herself avoided the fortune-teller's table altogether, steering conversations elsewhere. Curious, that. As the afternoon stretched on, shadows grew long across the lawn. The string quartet shifted to a slower tune, and a faint breeze stirred the tablecloths. Miss Marple set down her empty teacup and folded her hands. She had the distinct impression that beneath the merriment something was about to surface. Secrets had a way of slipping out when laughter was loudest. And indeed, they soon would. The afternoon of the garden party arrived in a blaze of sunlight, the kind of golden warmth that seemed almost too perfect for an English summer. St. Mary Mead's narrow lanes bustled with villagers dressed in their Sunday best, parasols unfurled, and hats adorned with flowers and feathers bobbing merrily as their wearers made their way toward Chatterton Manor. The manor itself looked splendid. Its ivy-clad walls gleamed in the light, and Lady Chatterton's gardeners had laboured to perfection. Roses spilled in riotous bloom, and neat rows of lavender released their fragrance as guests strolled past. Tables had been set upon the lawn, draped in crisp white cloths, each holding trays of delicate sandwiches, sugared scones, and bowls piled high with strawberries glistening like jewels. A string quartet played lightly beneath a striped marquee, their music carrying on the breeze. It was, in every sense, a scene of picturesque delight. Yet beneath the laughter and chatter, Miss Marple could sense undercurrents. She noticed, for example, how Mrs. Price Ridley swept past Lady Chatterton with only the briefest of nods, her lips pressed thin. A trifle rude, certainly, and yet not entirely without reason, for Lady Chatterton's smile, though wide, did not reach her eyes. Clusters of villagers formed and reformed across the lawn, like dancers shifting partners. Mrs. Hartnell was already recounting, in tones far too loud, how the local butcher had been short on cuts of lamb that week, while the vicar's wife leaned in to whisper something scandalous to the schoolmistress. Dr. Haydock, balancing a plate and a glass of punch, stood apart, observing everyone with the same clinical detachment he might bring to his patients. Miss Marple, quietly sipping her tea from a china cup, allowed her gaze to wander. A garden party, she often thought, was a curious theatre in which the whole village performed its roles. One only had to watch carefully to see which actors were out of step. And there were oddities indeed. A gentleman unknown to most had arrived, a tall man in a dark suit far too warm for the season. He spoke little, offering curt nods, and lingered near the edge of the gathering as though seeking someone or avoiding them. When Miss Marple asked Mrs. Clement who he might be, the vicar's wife hesitated. "Oh, a cousin of Lady Chatterton's, I believe. From London." Her tone suggested she herself was not entirely certain. Meanwhile, Laughter broke out near the marquee. The fortune-teller, a rosy-cheeked woman in a shawl, had begun drawing cards for eager villagers. Some treated it as a joke, others leaned in with earnest curiosity. Miss Marple noticed how Lady Chatterton herself avoided the fortune-teller's table altogether, steering conversations elsewhere. Curious, that, as the afternoon stretched on, shadows grew long across the lawn. The string quartet shifted to a slower tune, and a faint breeze stirred the tablecloths. Miss Marple set down her empty teacup and folded her hands. She had the distinct impression that beneath the merriment something was about to surface. Secrets had a way of slipping out when laughter was loudest. And indeed, they soon would. Though the garden party bustled with laughter and clinking teacups, there were always those who slipped away from the crowds. It was in the Rose Walk, an enchanting stretch of blooms that arched over trellises like a fragrant tunnel, that Miss Marple found herself strolling, her step unhurried, her eyes sharp despite her mild expression. The roses were at their peak, crimson and ivory blossoms nodding in the summer air, their petals soft as velvet. Bees hummed lazily from bloom to bloom, yet the hush of this shaded path felt strangely at odds with the merriment behind her. A rose walk, Miss Marple thought, was a place for confidences, and, if one were careless, for secrets to be overheard. She had not gone far before she noticed two figures lingering ahead, partially hidden by a cluster of particularly fine yellow roses. It was Mrs. Price Ridley and the mysterious gentleman in the dark suit. Their voices were hushed, almost fierce, though the words carried just enough on the still air. "You cannot simply appear here after all these years," Mrs. Price Ridley said, her tone tight. The man's reply was lower, almost a growl. "I told you, I had no choice. She mustn't know, not yet." Miss Marple's gaze drifted politely toward a rose as if she admired its bloom, though her ears remained attuned. Mrs. Price Ridley gave a quick glance behind her, lips pinched, then whispered again, "You should leave before someone begins to ask questions. It is dangerous to linger." At that, the man turned sharply, his expression shadowed. "Dangerous for whom, I wonder?" Their footsteps retreated further down the path, swallowed by the hush of blossoms. Miss Marple, thoughtful, continued her walk, pausing to pluck a leaf that had fallen upon her sleeve. Dangerous! Such a word did not find its way into idle conversation at a garden party, not unless something lay beneath. Further along the Rose Walk, another whisper caught her attention. This time it was Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, in hushed conversation with Lady Chatterton herself. Their tones were softer, anxious, as though the roses themselves might betray them. "But you promised it was settled," Mrs. Clement murmured. Lady Chatterton's reply trembled slightly. "It was. At least, I believed so. Yet things have a way of resurfacing, don't they? Like weeds, no matter how one pulls them up." Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but inwardly her mind ticked over like the quiet clock on her parlour mantelpiece. Secrets, indeed, were blossoming in the garden as surely as the roses, and perhaps proving thornier than any gardener might tame. As she turned back toward the lawn, a faint rustle drew her eyes. The fortune-teller, shawl drawn tightly about her shoulders despite the warmth, lingered at the entrance to the Rose Walk. She caught Miss Marple's gaze and offered a curious smile, knowing, almost sly. For a fleeting moment, Miss Marple wondered if the woman, too, had overheard. The music swelled again as she stepped from the shadows of the roses into sunlight, yet the festive notes could not dispel the unease that had crept into the air. Somewhere in St. Mary Mead, a story was unfolding, and she had just heard its first whispered lines. By late afternoon, the garden party had reached that pleasant lull when conversation meandered, and the air hung heavy with the scent of roses and warm grass. It was precisely then that the vicar's wife, perhaps seeking novelty for her guests, suggested a turn with the fortune-teller. The figure in question, Madame Céline as she styled herself, had set up a little table beneath the ancient oak at the edge of the lawn. A length of dark velvet covered its surface, upon which lay a deck of well-worn cards and a curious glass sphere that caught the sunlight in queer, fractured gleams. Though some of the younger guests laughed at the idea, others seemed drawn by the novelty of it, and soon a small cluster gathered around. Miss Marple, from her seat with her embroidery resting on her lap, observed with mild interest. Fortune-tellers were hardly uncommon at fêtes, though this one struck her as rather more solemn than most. She was tall, her shawl heavy despite the summer warmth, and her eyes, dark, steady, seemed to see far more than her polite smile suggested. Lady Chatterton was persuaded to sit first. With nervous laughter, she extended her hand across the table. Madame Céline traced the lines of her palm with long, deliberate fingers, her voice low enough that only those nearest could catch the words. "Your path has been shadowed," she murmured, "but a choice awaits you soon. Be cautious, for not all who smile are your friends." A hush fell over the little circle. Lady Chatterton's laughter faltered, and she withdrew her hand quickly, her eyes darting about as though half expecting a hidden enemy among the teacups and cucumber sandwiches. Then came Mrs. Clement, who, though shy, agreed after much coaxing. Madame Céline studied her palm in silence for a moment before speaking. "Something thought buried will rise again. The past does not rest as easily as we might wish." There was a ripple of discomfort, for the words seemed to carry an uncanny weight. Mrs. Clement paled slightly, clasping her hands as though in prayer, while her husband cleared his throat with an anxious little cough. By now, the gaiety of the game had dulled. Guests shifted, whispering to one another, their curiosity pricked by the odd seriousness of the woman's tone. It was not at all the merry fortune-telling one expected at a village fete. And then, in the midst of the murmurs, Madame Céline turned her gaze, direct, unwavering, toward Miss Marple herself. "And you, madam," she said, voice calm but resonant, "you will uncover a truth most would rather leave hidden. But beware, for truths carry thorns, and some are sharper than any rose." There was a beat of silence, broken only by the faint rattle of a teacup placed too hastily on its saucer. Miss Marple, composed as ever, inclined her head with the faintest smile. "Why, how very interesting," she said mildly, as though she had been told nothing more startling than a change in the weather. But inwardly she noted the shifting of the air, the way laughter seemed to have fled the lawn, leaving in its place a thin thread of unease. Madame Céline's words lingered like a shadow at dusk, stretching long and dark across the roses. And somewhere in the village, Miss Marple felt certain that shadow would soon deepen. By late afternoon, the garden party had reached that pleasant lull when conversation meandered, and the air hung heavy with the scent of roses and warm grass. It was precisely then that the vicar's wife, perhaps seeking novelty for her guests, suggested a turn with the fortune-teller. The figure in question, Madame Céline as she styled herself, had set up a little table beneath the ancient oak at the edge of the lawn. A length of dark velvet covered its surface, upon which lay a deck of well-worn cards and a curious glass sphere that caught the sunlight in queer, fractured gleams. Though some of the younger guests laughed at the idea, others seemed drawn by the novelty of it, and soon a small cluster gathered around. Miss Marple, from her seat with her embroidery resting on her lap, observed with mild interest. Fortune-tellers were hardly uncommon at fêtes, though this one struck her as rather more solemn than most. She was tall, her shawl heavy despite the summer warmth, and her eyes, dark, steady, seemed to see far more than her polite smile suggested. Lady Chatterton was persuaded to sit first. With nervous laughter, she extended her hand across the table. Madame Céline traced the lines of her palm with long, deliberate fingers, her voice low enough that only those nearest could catch the words. "Your path has been shadowed," she murmured, "but a choice awaits you soon. Be cautious, for not all who smile are your friends." A hush fell over the little circle. Lady Chatterton's laughter faltered, and she withdrew her hand quickly, her eyes darting about as though half expecting a hidden enemy among the teacups and cucumber sandwiches. Then came Mrs. Clement, who, though shy, agreed after much coaxing. Madame Céline studied her palm in silence for a moment before speaking. "Something thought buried will rise again. The past does not rest as easily as we might wish." There was a ripple of discomfort, for the words seemed to carry an uncanny weight. Mrs. Clement paled slightly, clasping her hands as though in prayer, while her husband cleared his throat with an anxious little cough. By now, the gaiety of the game had dulled. Guests shifted, whispering to one another, their curiosity pricked by the odd seriousness of the woman's tone. It was not at all the merry fortune-telling one expected at a village fête. And then, in the midst of the murmurs, Madame Céline turned her gaze, direct, unwavering, toward Miss Marple herself. "And you, madam," she said, voice calm but resonant, "you will uncover a truth most would rather leave hidden. But beware, for truths carry thorns, and some are sharper than any rose." There was a beat of silence, broken only by the faint rattle of a teacup placed too hastily on its saucer. Miss Marple, composed as ever, inclined her head with the faintest smile. "Why, how very interesting," she said mildly, as though she had been told nothing more startling than a change in the weather. But inwardly she noted the shifting of the air, the way laughter seemed to have fled the lawn, leaving in its place a thin thread of unease. Madame Céline's words lingered like a shadow at dusk, stretching long and dark across the roses. And somewhere in the village, Miss Marple felt certain that shadow would soon deepen. Chapter 3. A Sudden Disappearance. The fête drew on into early evening, lanterns being strung from tree to tree, their soft glow mingling with the fading light of day. The vicar's lawn, once filled with laughter and chatter, now bore a subtle undercurrent of tension, as though Madame Céline's words had planted seeds of unease that refused to be brushed away. Still, villagers did their best to carry on. Children raced about chasing fireflies, while the vicar called for a hymn to be sung as the sun slipped low. It was during this gentle bustle that someone first remarked upon the absence of Mrs. Clement. She had been seen only half an hour before, standing near the rose arch with her shawl gathered tightly about her shoulders, speaking in low tones to her husband. But when tea was served again, and little plates of sponge cake offered, she was nowhere to be found. "Gone to fetch her wrap, no doubt," murmured one of the ladies, though her voice lacked conviction. Mr. Clement, looking flustered, assured everyone that his wife was simply resting a moment indoors. Yet his eyes flicked nervously toward the churchyard beyond the hedge, betraying an uncertainty that did not escape Miss Marple. When a quarter of an hour passed without Mrs. Clement's return, murmurs rippled through the gathering. Guests began to search discreetly, first the parlour, then the garden paths, even the kitchen where the maid insisted she had not been. At last, Mr. Clement himself hurried off toward the lane, his steps brisk, his face pale. Miss Marple, meanwhile, observed in silence. She had seen Mrs. Clement retreat from the fortune-teller's table with visible distress, her expression troubled, almost frightened. A woman carrying some burden, Miss Marple had thought at the time. And now she had vanished. "Do you think she has taken ill?" asked Lady Chatterton, her voice tinged with alarm. "It is possible," Miss Marple replied gently, though her keen eyes roamed the gathering twilight. "But people do not simply dissolve into the evening air. If Mrs. Clement is not with us, then she must be somewhere else." It was said with such calm certainty that several ladies shivered despite themselves. Soon the search widened. Lanterns were fetched, and small groups fanned out across the churchyard, the orchard, and the narrow lanes leading away from the vicarage. Laughter and music had ceased entirely. The fete, once so cheerful, now felt like a stage upon which something darker had crept uninvited. By the time the clock in the church tower struck 8, the whispers had grown into anxious speculation. A woman gone missing at so genteel an affair, it was unthinkable, yet undeniable. Madame Céline, seated still and silent at a little table, was observed with sidelong glances, as though her strange predictions had conjured this very misfortune. Miss Marple stood at the edge of the lawn, hands folded lightly, her gaze fixed on the rose arch where Mrs. Clement had last been seen. Somewhere in the gathering dark, she felt, lay both the woman and the key to a secret long kept hidden. And the night, though soft with lantern glow, suddenly seemed to hold its breath. The summer dusk had deepened into a violet hush, lanterns swaying gently in the faintest breeze. Villagers, once content with tea and chatter, now scattered across the vicarage grounds with furrowed brows and lowered voices. What had begun as a fete of merriment had turned into something altogether different, an anxious search under the cloak of twilight. Mr. Clement led the charge, his lantern bobbing in the lane, calling his wife's name in a tone that betrayed both irritation and dread. A few younger men followed, their boots crunching on the gravel, while the women lingered nearer the churchyard, whispering amongst themselves. Miss Marple, however, did not hurry. She moved at her own pace, her little lace-gloved hands folded neatly over her handbag, her sharp eyes taking in what others missed. Near the rose arch where Mrs. Clement had last stood, she noted the faintest impression of a heel in the soft earth, pressed deeper than a casual step. The kind of mark, she thought, left by someone hesitating or resisting. "Strange, is it not?" said Lady Chatterton beside her, "how she could vanish in such a small place? If she were faint, surely she would have been found by now." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured, stooping to examine the ground. "But sometimes, dear Lady Chatterton, people do not wish to be found at all." Meanwhile, a group of villagers combed the churchyard. Lantern light danced across the mossy headstones, and the night air seemed to carry whispers through the yews. Someone cried out at a flicker of white behind the trees, only to discover it was a sheet left out to dry, caught on a low branch. Nervous laughter followed, but it quickly died. The shadows were playing tricks, and the thought of a woman wandering alone amongst the graves unsettled everyone. At the orchard, the searchers fared no better. The branches rustled, heavy with fruit, but no voice answered their calls. Beyond the orchard lay only the narrow path toward the woods, too dark, too unwelcoming for many to enter. Yet the thought that Mrs. Clement might have ventured there was enough to cast an uneasy silence over the party. Back at the lawn, Miss Marple found herself standing beside Madame Céline, whose hands still rested on her silken cloth. The fortune-teller's dark eyes glistened as though with secret knowledge. "You see, do you not?" Madame Céline whispered. "The stars never lie. A shadow was upon her even as she sat before me." Miss Marple regarded her with polite composure. "Or perhaps," she said softly, "you happened to glimpse what was plain to any observant soul, though cloaked, as ever, in theatrical words." Madame Céline smiled faintly, but said no more. By now, the villagers had regrouped, weary and unsettled. No trace of Mrs. Clement had been found, and the evening pressed on, heavy with unanswered questions. The fete was forgotten, the merriment dissolved. Only the hush of night remained, filled with the rustle of hedges and the occasional toll of a distant bell. Miss Marple lifted her gaze toward the darkened lane. Somewhere out there, she felt, lay not only Mrs. Clement, but the first true clue to unravelling what had just begun. Morning broke over St. Mary Mead with deceptive serenity. The roses still climbed neatly along cottage walls, the milkman still clattered his cans upon the lane, and the church bell tolled its usual call. Yet beneath the polished surface of village life ran a current of unease. Mrs. Clement had not returned, and the fact whispered through parlours and across hedges like a draught under a locked door. At the vicarage, a hushed gathering had formed. The manor drawing-room, usually reserved for garden society teas, now played host to anxious speculation. The lace curtains were half drawn, the sunlight filtered in muted gold, and on the sideboard sat an untouched tray of scones, prepared the previous day but left forgotten. Lady Chatterton was the first to speak plainly, her voice carrying across the room. "My dears, it is too strange. A woman does not simply vanish from a fate unless she means to, or unless someone else has a hand in it." Mrs. Price Ridley, perched stiffly on a chair, clutched her teacup like a weapon. "Exactly so. And if you ask me, it would not be the first time the Clements have had entanglements. One hears things, even if one is too discreet to repeat them." "Too discreet, indeed," muttered Colonel Melrose, though his eyes gleamed with interest. From the hearth, Miss Marple listened quietly. She did not join in the rush of gossip, but absorbed every word, every inflection, every pointed glance. She had long since learned that people reveal more when they think they are merely speculating. And speculate they did. Some insisted Mrs. Clement had been unwell and might have fainted in a remote corner of the orchard. Others darkly hinted at scandal, an admirer, perhaps, or some clandestine arrangement. A few, lower still in their whispers, wondered aloud whether Madame Céline had foreseen something dreadful and withheld the truth. Amid the chatter, Mrs. Bantry leaned toward Miss Marple. "You were near her last, were you not? Did you notice anything unusual?" Miss Marple set her knitting upon her lap and adjusted her spectacles. "Unusual, no. But perhaps thoughtful." She seemed less absorbed by the fate than by something else entirely, something inward. As if she were listening not to our chatter, but to some private echo. The words silenced the room for a moment, the ladies and gentlemen exchanging uneasy glances. To picture the vicar's wife haunted by a secret was both thrilling and disquieting. It was then that young Inspector Graves entered, fresh from the market square where word had spread too quickly. His boots carried in the scent of dust, his face drawn with the gravity of duty. "I must ask," he said firmly, "that each of you remain available for questioning. Until Mrs. Clement is found, we cannot assume this is merely a fainting spell or a night's misadventure. There are matters here that require closer attention." The air thickened. No one sipped their tea now, and as the inspector's words settled upon the room, Miss Marple folded her hands once more, her eyes drifting to the window where the garden stretched in innocent bloom. A garden that, she thought, might still be holding its secret. The fortune-teller's tent, once a quaint attraction draped in velvet and candlelight, had become a subject of great importance. Madame Céline, with her flowing shawls and rings that glimmered like droplets of moonlight, was not easily shaken. Yet when Inspector Graves requested a word with her, she hesitated, an uncharacteristic pause that Miss Marple noted with keen interest. "Of course, Inspector," Madame Céline said at last, her voice smooth but carrying a faint tremor. "Though I fear my gifts are for entertainment more than inquiry." The inspector inclined his head, not unkindly. "Nevertheless, madam, we must hear what you know. Mrs. Clement was last seen near your tent. Did she say anything to you, anything at all, that might shed light upon her disappearance?" Madame Céline folded her hands, each adorned finger tapping lightly upon the other as though searching for courage. "She came to me for a reading, yes. But it was not her future she seemed to fear, it was her past." The room shifted. Mrs. Price Ridley gave a theatrical gasp, while Colonel Melrose muttered something about melodrama. But Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her needle still in motion. "Do continue," Miss Marple urged gently. Madame Céline's dark eyes flickered toward her, then returned to the inspector. She asked about a shadow, an old shadow that had returned. I drew the cards, and there it was, the tower beside the moon, with the 7 of swords. She turned pale and whispered, "It has come back at last." Before I could press her, she excused herself. "I thought she needed air." Inspector Graves's brows knit. "Did she explain what she meant by it?" "No," Céline admitted, lowering her gaze. "But she did ask one curious thing. She inquired if secrets buried in gardens ever truly remain hidden." The words fell with a peculiar weight, as though each person in the manor drawing-room suddenly felt the earth beneath their feet more heavily than before. Mrs. Bantry shivered despite the warmth of the fire. Colonel Melrose, unwilling to surrender his scepticism, gave a gruff laugh. "Garden secrets indeed. Next she'll tell us a ghost carried her off." Yet Miss Marple did not laugh. Instead, she observed Madame Celine's hands, how they trembled when they reached for her shawl. It was not the trembling of an actress prolonging drama. It was the tremor of one who had seen more than she cared to tell. After the questioning ended, the villagers drifted into little knots of speculation. Some dismissed Celine's words as carnival nonsense, but others whispered about old scandals, hidden deeds, and family feuds that might indeed be buried in gardens. Miss Marple, however, remained quietly thoughtful. She knew from long experience that behind every superstition lay a kernel of truth, however small. And as she gazed out the window toward the vicarage garden, she could not help but wonder, had Mrs. Clement's secret finally pushed its way to the surface, like a root breaking through the soil? Chapter 4. The Hidden Letter. The morning after the fortune-teller's unsettling revelations dawned grey and still, the kind of weather that made the air taste of damp earth and lingering smoke from the night's hearth fires. Villagers went about their routines with a hint of unease, their conversations hushed, eyes darting more quickly toward hedgerows and shuttered windows. At the vicarage, Miss Marple had accepted Mrs. Bantry's invitation to join her for tea in the garden, though, truth be told, the old sleuth's purpose was more than the simple enjoyment of buttered scones. The fortune-teller's words about secrets buried in gardens had taken root in her mind, and Miss Marple had long believed that gardens told truths just as much as gossip did. While Mrs. Bantry prattled about her chrysanthemums and the scandal of Colonel Melrose's new gardener who, she claimed, trimmed hedges like a man hacking through the jungle, Miss Marple let her eyes wander. They drifted past the neatly kept beds to the old stone sundial, a fixture that had stood for centuries. Something about the ground near its base seemed disturbed, as though soil had been recently turned. "Dear Mrs. Bantry," Miss Marple interrupted softly, "would you mind terribly if I had a closer look at your sundial? I promise not to trample your geraniums." Mrs. Bantry chuckled. "At my age, I'm grateful to anyone who shows interest in the thing. Do go ahead, Jane." With surprising agility for her years, Miss Marple bent near the sundial and brushed the soil with the tip of her parasol. The earth crumbled more loosely than the rest of the garden, revealing the corner of something pale, paper, perhaps, or fabric. She delicately worked it free, and sure enough, a folded, yellowing envelope emerged, its edges frayed with time but the seal intact. Mrs. Bantry gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "Gracious heavens! What on earth is that doing there?" The envelope bore no address, only a name written in elegant, slanting script, Eleanor Clement. The two women exchanged a look heavy with unspoken questions. Miss Marple, with characteristic calm, merely said, "I think it best we open it, don't you?" The letter inside was brief, but its contents were enough to stir both dread and fascination. "Eleanor, it is no use pretending. The truth will not stay buried forever. Meet me at the garden gate at dusk, or all will be revealed. You know what is at stake. No signature, no clue as to the author. Only the weight of an unspoken threat pressed between the faded ink and brittle paper." Mrs. Bantry whispered, "It's like something out of a dreadful novel. Do you suppose this is why she disappeared?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. She simply folded the letter again, her expression unreadable. At last, she murmured, "A garden never forgets, my dear. Nor do those who plant secrets within it. The question now is, whose hand wrote these words, and whose fear kept them hidden all this time. News of the hidden letter spread through St. Mary Mead with the swiftness of ivy climbing a garden wall. By evening, it seemed every villager had heard some version of the tale, though each retelling bore a fresh embellishment. At the Blue Boar, Mr. Pritchard swore the letter was written in blood. At the post office, Mrs. Price Ridley insisted it contained a confession to murder. By the time dusk settled over the village, the truth was already tangled in a web of whispers. Miss Marple, however, preferred first-hand observation over gossip. When Colonel Melrose invited her and Mrs. Bantry to the manor for supper, ostensibly to discuss the matter of Eleanor Clement, she accepted without hesitation. The manor house, with its ivy-draped facade and faintly echoing halls, was a natural breeding ground for speculation. Dinner passed with polite conversation, though one could sense the undercurrent of unease. The Colonel, ever bluff and forthright, tried to dismiss the affair. "Probably some silly old love note," he declared between spoonfuls of soup. "I dare say it means nothing." Yet his wife darted quick glances toward the letter resting in Miss Marple's reticule, as though it might leap out and reveal something dreadful. It was in the drawing-room afterward, with the fire casting flickering shadows on the panelled walls, that the whispers began in earnest. Mrs. Bantry, lowering her voice, wondered aloud if Eleanor Clement had once been courted by someone unsuitable. Mrs. Melrose mentioned, almost too casually, that Eleanor had been seen walking near the manor gates late at night many years ago, though whether to meet a lover or to flee from one, no one could say. Miss Marple listened, knitting calmly, her needles clicking in steady rhythm. She knew well that gossip, for all its frivolity, often carried grains of truth hidden beneath its frothy surface. What caught her attention most was the way Mrs. Melrose hesitated before mentioning Eleanor's nocturnal walks. The pause was brief, but it spoke volumes to a mind trained to observe what others overlooked. Colonel Melrose grew irritable at last. "This is nonsense," he barked. "Old scandals resurrected for no good reason. If Eleanor Clement disappeared, it was her own doing. And I'll not have my household dragged into baseless chatter." But chatter was not so easily silenced. Even as the Colonel stamped his foot and reached for his pipe, the whispers continued in lowered tones, curling through the manor's corridors like smoke. Servants glanced nervously at one another, their unease mirroring that of their betters. And Miss Marple, noting every flicker of expression, every slip of the tongue, quietly filed each detail away. As she took her leave that night, she paused at the threshold of the grand hall. The wind had risen, rattling the windows, and somewhere deep within the house a door slammed shut of its own accord. A shiver ran along the air, carrying with it a single, unsettling thought. Perhaps Eleanor Clement had indeed stood at this very gate one dusky evening, waiting for a meeting that sealed her fate. The morning of the fair dawned with a brilliance that seemed almost determined to chase away the shadows of unease that had recently settled upon St. Mary Mead. Sunlight spilled over the hedgerows, and the church bells rang cheerfully as villagers bustled about the green, stringing bunting between trees and setting up wooden stalls. The air carried the mingled scents of freshly baked scones, sugared almonds, and cut grass, a heady perfume that made one forget, if only for a moment, that secrets might linger behind the smiling faces. Miss Marple arrived arm-in-arm with Dolly Bantry, the two ladies admiring the rows of stalls selling everything from preserves and jams to embroidered handkerchiefs. Children darted between their skirts with sticky fingers and laughter, while young men tried their hand at the coconut shy, the sound of thudding balls punctuating the general merriment. "Such a relief," Mrs. Bantry sighed, adjusting her wide-brimmed hat, "to see the village gathered together in cheer, instead of whispering dreadful tales about poor Eleanor Clement." But Miss Marple, her keen blue eyes scanning the crowd, noticed something rather different. For every smile, there was a glance exchanged, furtive, sharp, or hurriedly concealed. Whispers clung to the fair like the scent of toffee apples. People could not help themselves. Where a mystery lingered, speculation bloomed as freely as the roses in the vicarage garden. At the cake competition tent, Mrs. Price Ridley leaned far too close to Mrs. Hartnell, muttering in a tone meant to be hushed yet audible to anyone within 3 feet. "I heard Eleanor Clement once worked secretly at the manor. Imagine! Keeping house after hours. There must have been a reason she was there at such odd times." Mrs. Hartnell gasped, pressing a lace-gloved hand to her chest. Surely not respectable to go unchaperoned. Nearby, young Tommy Briggs, the grocer's boy, declared that his uncle had seen a shadowy figure near the manor gate late at night. His tale drew a circle of eager listeners, each nodding with the seriousness of jurors at a trial. Miss Marple, sipping tea from a paper cup, allowed herself a faint smile. She knew villagers well enough to understand that truth, rumour, and imagination were often blended in equal measure at such gatherings. Yet amidst the frivolity of coconut shies and raffles, something more telling often slipped through the cracks, an unguarded remark, a nervous laugh, a face paling at the wrong moment. Her opportunity came during the tombola draw. As the vicar's wife cheerfully announced ticket numbers, Miss Marple caught sight of Colonel Melrose's wife stiffening when the prize, a silver-framed photograph donated anonymously, was revealed. It depicted the manor in its earlier days, ivy trailing less thickly, its windows wide and gleaming. Mrs. Melrose's lips tightened, her gaze flicking away almost immediately, as though she had glimpsed something best forgotten. Miss Marple tucked this reaction neatly into her mental file. Amid bunting and sugared sweets, the fair had offered her precisely what she came for, another small thread in the tapestry of truth. And as dusk began to fall, with lanterns strung like fairy lights across the green, she knew the festival's gaiety only sharpened the contrast with a mystery still winding its way through the heart of St. Mary Mead. Chapter 5. An Unexpected Clue. The fair had dwindled into twilight, the lanterns casting soft halos of golden light over the village green. Most of the stalls were shuttered now, and laughter had given way to the quieter murmur of villagers strolling homeward. Miss Marple lingered by the church gate, her knitting bag neatly tucked under one arm, as she exchanged parting words with Mrs. Bantry. Yet her mind was not on pleasantries. A detail, small, easily overlooked, had just taken root in her thoughts. Earlier that afternoon, as she examined the jam stall, she had noticed Eleanor Clement's niece, young Clara, carrying a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. At first, it seemed unremarkable, the sort of package any girl might fetch from the grocer's. But as Clara passed by, the paper had shifted slightly, and Miss Marple's sharp eyes glimpsed what appeared to be an antique pocket watch, its silver chain glinting in the sun. Now, what struck Miss Marple as peculiar was not the watch itself, but the expression on Clara's face, guilty, anxious, as though she feared being seen with it. And if Miss Marple's memory served her right, Hadn't that very watch once belonged to Colonel Melrose? She recalled seeing it gleaming on his waistcoat at church not a year ago. Curious, Miss Marple murmured softly, her lips barely moving. Mrs. Bantry, ever eager for intrigue, leaned closer. What was that, Jane? Oh, nothing, my dear, Miss Marple replied with a benign smile. Merely admiring the lanterns. But her thoughts spun quickly. A watch, connected to the manor, connected perhaps to Eleanor Clement's untimely death. Why was Clara carrying it? And why had Mrs. Melrose looked so unsettled by that photograph earlier in the day? Such trifles, when considered alone, were easily dismissed. Yet together they began to hum with quiet significance. As Miss Marple walked slowly home along the lane, she let her eyes wander over the hedgerows and gardens, gathering the day's impressions like wildflowers to be arranged later into a pattern. She recalled how Mrs. Price Ridley had muttered about Eleanor working secretly at the manor, how the grocer's boy had spoken of a shadow in the night. Add to this the watch and the photograph. Ah yes, a faint outline was emerging. The village itself seemed to hold its breath. From cottage windows came the glow of lamplight, the scent of wood smoke drifted in the air. Yet beneath this cosy veil lay unease, as palpable as the chill rising from the fields. Secrets were pressing against the surface, like letters tucked inside an envelope waiting to be opened. When Miss Marple reached her gate, she paused and looked back at the manor on the distant hill. A single window glowed faintly in the darkened house. Who was there at this hour? And why? The watch, the photograph, the whispers, they were pieces of a puzzle that only needed the right hand to fit them into place. Miss Marple, of course, had every intention of being that hand. The following morning broke clear but cool, the kind of English day when the air feels scrubbed clean after a night of rain. Yet inside the village, warmth gave way to whispers, and every shop door seemed to harbour speculation. By midday, it was no longer simply Eleanor Clement's passing that stirred tongues, it was the Melrose family. Miss Marple, carrying her knitting basket toward the grocer's, noticed the atmosphere before she heard it. People paused mid-step, voices dipped, and eyes darted toward the manor on the hill. Mr. Tilley, the butcher, claimed he had seen Mrs. Melrose slip into the church vestry at an unusual hour. Mrs. Price Ridley, never one to withhold opinion, insisted that Colonel Melrose had quarrelled with Eleanor only days before her death. And young Clara, poor girl, seemed to find herself the subject of pitying looks, as though her bright youth were tarnished by association. Miss Marple listened politely, neither confirming nor denying, but inside her mind a careful ledger was being written. It was one thing to gossip, quite another to observe the telling detail. When Colonel Melrose appeared at the grocer's himself, tall and grave in his grey coat, the room fell silent save for the creak of the floorboards. He acknowledged the villagers with a curt nod, but Miss Marple, with her uncanny intuition, noted the stiffness in his shoulders. Guilt, fear, or the natural pride of a man beleaguered by rumour. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple walked up the lane toward the manor, the path lined with dripping hedgerows and fallen leaves that clung damply to her shoes. The house, once a symbol of authority and tradition, now seemed brooding under its gables, as though the very bricks resented the scrutiny cast upon them. She was received in the drawing-room by Mrs. Melrose, whose pale hands fidgeted with a teacup that rattled against the saucer. "It is dreadful," "Miss Marple," she said with a tremor in her voice. "The way they look at us, as though we had anything to do with that poor girl's fate." Miss Marple smiled gently, the picture of compassion, yet her eyes studied every movement, every hesitation. "Village talk is a storm in a teacup, my dear. It blows fiercely for a time, then passes. But tell me, did Eleanor Clement often come here?" Mrs. Melrose hesitated. A second too long. "On occasion, yes. She was fond of the library." "Ah," said Miss Marple, knitting her words as neatly as her wool. "A fondness for books is an innocent enough habit. Unless, of course, the books themselves conceal something more." At that, Mrs. Melrose's hand slipped, and tea splashed across the lace cloth. Her cheeks flushed, and though she hurried to blot the stain, the mark remained, a small but undeniable sign that truth was pressing hard against the surface. Outside, the wind stirred the trees, rattling the window panes. Within the manor, tensions were rising indeed, and Miss Marple sensed that the heart of the mystery beat louder here than anywhere else in St. Mary Mead. If the manor had become the storm's eye, the village itself was the wind carrying rumour from door to door. By the next market day, every soul in St. Mary Mead had heard a different version of Eleanor Clement's death, and each version contradicted the last. In the bakery, over sugared buns, it was whispered that Eleanor had been seen quarrelling with a man in a dark coat. At the post office, the story shifted. She had written a letter, torn it up, and thrown the scraps into the fire. And at the vicarage tea, Mrs. Price Ridley declared with relish that Eleanor had been engaged in some kind of forbidden romance, though with whom she could not say. Miss Marple, seated quietly with her embroidery, let the chatter wash over her like the hum of bees. For every truth in St. Mary Mead, there were a dozen embellishments, and it was in those embellishments that she found her greatest clues. People invented what they did not know, but in doing so, they revealed their fears, their envies, their dislikes. At the grocer's, young Clara was pitied openly. "So tragic for her, losing a friend," sighed Mrs. Hartnell. Yet Miss Marple noted that Clara, pale and subdued, barely touched the apple she carried. Her eyes flitted toward the ground whenever Eleanor's name was spoken. Was it grief or guilt? Meanwhile, Mr. Badger, the village handyman, claimed to have seen a lantern moving about the manor grounds at midnight. "Like a phantom, it was," he muttered. The villagers leaned in, wide-eyed, but Miss Marple's lips twitched with the faintest smile. Lanterns did not float by themselves. Someone had been abroad that night, and Mr. Badger, though prone to exaggeration, had likely stumbled upon something important. What struck her most, however, was how swiftly suspicion turned to the Melroses. The Colonel was described alternately as a tyrant, a bankrupt, and a man with a secret ledger of debts. Mrs. Melrose, in another version, was painted as a jealous wife, protective to the point of cruelty. And poor Clara, well, Clara was said to have envied Eleanor's charm, her friendships, her freedom. None of it was consistent, yet all of it fanned the flames of unease. That evening, as Miss Marple sipped her solitary cup of cocoa, she reflected that gossip was rather like lace, delicate, intricate, and often beautiful, but capable of concealing as much as it revealed. Within its patterns lay hidden knots, and it was her task to trace them to the truth. She remembered Mrs. Melrose's slip with the teacup, the Colonel's rigid posture, Clara's evasive eyes. Each detail was a thread, and the gossip, though tangled, helped her see where those threads might connect. Still, she mused, there was something missing, a piece that had not yet been spoken aloud, or perhaps deliberately withheld. The church bell tolled 9, deep and sonorous. Outside, the village slept. Inside, Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, eyes half closed. Somewhere within that web of talk lay the whisper of a killer, and she intended to find it. The next morning dawned with a veil of mist lying low over St. Mary Mead, curling around the gravestones like pale ribbons. Miss Marple, wrapped in her sturdy shawl, walked steadily along the church path, her boots crunching the gravel in the hush of early light. She always said a churchyard was an excellent place for contemplation. The stillness had a way of clarifying one's thoughts, and the dead, unlike the living, never gossiped. Today, however, she was not here merely for reflection. She had heard, through Mrs. Price Ridley, of course, that Eleanor Clement had been seen in the churchyard shortly before her death, carrying a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. What could have drawn her here, at such an hour? Miss Marple's sharp eyes roved across the stones, some leaning, some overgrown with moss. She paused at the Clement family plot, where weathered names were barely legible. There, in the soft soil beside the headstone, she noticed something curious, a depression, as though someone had knelt, or perhaps dug, quite recently. Stooping down with surprising agility for her age, she brushed aside a tuft of damp grass and found the faint glint of paper. A torn corner, browned and softened by dew, but still bearing a fragment of writing, meant owed, by. She folded the scrap carefully into her handkerchief, her mind already ticking. A debt. The Colonel's whispered reputation for financial troubles suddenly seemed less rumour and more substance. Just then, the sound of footsteps echoed across the yard. Clara appeared, her head bent, a bouquet of wilting violets in her hands. She started when she saw Miss Marple. "Oh, I only came to tidy the graves," she stammered. Miss Marple smiled kindly. "A thoughtful duty, my dear. These violets, were they Eleanor's favourite?" Clara's fingers trembled, scattering petals on the ground. "Yes. She loved them. I thought it right." The girl hurriedly laid the flowers on the grave and almost fled, her eyes refusing to meet Miss Marple's. Watching her retreat, Miss Marple noted the nervous haste, the guilty air. And yet, guilt did not always equal crime. It might be grief, or fear, or the knowledge of some secret better left unspoken. As the church bell chimed the half-hour, Miss Marple lingered a moment longer, her gaze settling on the Clement stone. A parcel, a scrap of paper hinting at debt, a young woman too frightened to linger, these were pieces of a larger puzzle. And like the shifting fog, the picture was beginning to take shape. She turned back toward the village, her step light despite the chill. Already she knew that the churchyard held not only the dead, but the first real whisper of truth. What Eleanor had hidden here, what she had perhaps died for, would guide Miss Marple to the next revelation. And, she thought with a spark of satisfaction, the village would be astonished at just how much a simple stroll among gravestones could reveal. Chapter 6. Miss Marple connects the threads. That evening, the lamps in Miss Marple's cottage glowed softly against the encroaching dusk. The smell of beeswax polish lingered faintly in the air, and the clock on the mantel ticked with steady rhythm. Seated in her favourite armchair, knitting laid neatly beside her, she reviewed the threads of the puzzle with the patience of one who has untangled many a ball of wool in her time. First, Eleanor Clement. Seen in the churchyard, bearing a parcel, her face troubled. A widow, genteel but not wealthy, whose late husband had been rumoured, more than once, to dabble in speculative ventures that ended poorly. And the torn paper she had discovered that morning spoke of debts, of obligations unfulfilled. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. Then there was Clara. A nervous girl, certainly, but was her tremor born of guilt or simply the weight of secrets that did not belong to her? Young women were often caught in matters beyond their control, Miss Marple knew, but nervous hands could not be ignored. And Colonel Harcourt. Bluff, hearty, and very quick to dismiss Eleanor's melancholy as nothing more than nerves. Too quick, perhaps. Men of his sort often blustered when a quieter conscience might trouble them. He had spoken loudly of Eleanor's supposed frailties, but Miss Marple thought it odd that he never once mentioned her parcel, despite being known for his sharp eyes. Miss Marple sipped her tea, letting the warmth settle her thoughts. What most people overlooked was that crime, in villages especially, rarely came from strangers. It was far more often the byproduct of everyday things: money, pride, jealousy, or the desperate attempt to cover a past indiscretion. Like weeds in a well-kept garden, they crept up quietly until, one day, they choked the flowers. She recalled the violets Clara had brought, the way her hands shook as she placed them. A symbol of affection, or guilt. And Eleanor's final walk to the churchyard with a parcel. Was it a gift, a letter, or perhaps evidence meant to be hidden? Setting down her cup, Miss Marple leaned back, her eyes half closed. Already the strands were tightening into a noose around the truth. She thought of something the vicar's wife had once said, that secrets in a small village could never be buried for long. And indeed, Eleanor's secret, whatever form it had taken, was slowly rising to the surface. The click of the clock punctuated her silence. Tomorrow she would call on Colonel Harcourt again, quite casually, and perhaps inquire about his investments. People often revealed more over a polite conversation than they ever would in the face of accusation. And Clara, yes, Clara needed careful watching. Not because she was wicked, but because she might unwittingly hold the key. Miss Marple smiled faintly. It was coming together, like embroidery when at last the pattern could be discerned from the stitches. The village thought itself peaceful, untouched by intrigue, but soon enough the truth would astonish them all. For in St. Mary Mead, even violets could whisper secrets. The twilight hour descended upon St. Mary Mead with a hush, the kind of stillness that seemed to hang like a veil between day and night. Lamps were lit in the drawing-room of Colonel Harcourt's house, where a small gathering had been arranged. The vicar's wife sat perched at the edge of her chair, her gloved hands folded primly in her lap. Clara twisted a handkerchief nervously, her eyes darting to the floor. Colonel Harcourt stood near the mantel, puffing on his pipe with forced cheer. And in the midst of them all, quiet as ever, sat Miss Marple. It was not in her nature to command a room, yet somehow she always did. With her soft voice and kindly manner, she invited confidence. And so, when she cleared her throat gently and folded her hands, all turned to listen. "You see," Miss Marple began, The matter was never about who disliked poor Eleanor Clement. It was, rather, about what she knew. Clara gave a little gasp, and the Colonel's pipe slipped from his mouth for the briefest moment. Miss Marple continued. Eleanor had come across certain papers, evidence, in fact, that concerned financial improprieties. Not her own, you understand, but those of someone she trusted. She had resolved to place these papers in safe hands. That was the purpose of her parcel. Unfortunately, she was prevented from doing so. The vicar's wife leaned forward, whispering, "Prevented? By whom?" Miss Marple's eyes rested gently on Colonel Harcourt. By a man who stood to lose everything if Eleanor spoke. Colonel, you had invested recklessly, and Eleanor knew it. Exposure would have meant not only disgrace but ruin. The Colonel's ruddy face darkened, his lips parting as though to protest, but Miss Marple raised a hand. Your bluster has been most useful in diverting suspicion. But you overlooked one thing. Eleanor confided in Clara, sweet, loyal Clara, who tried desperately to protect her memory, though her nerves betrayed her. The violets, Clara, they were meant as a gesture of affection, but to me they whispered guilt, not your own, but that of another whom you sought to shield. Clara's eyes brimmed with tears. I couldn't bear to think. Miss Marple's voice softened. And you need not. You are blameless, my dear. It was the Colonel who ensured Eleanor would never deliver her parcel. He intercepted her, took the papers, and hastily concealed them. But fate has a curious way of preserving the truth. For in his haste, he left behind a torn fragment, enough to reveal the whole. The room fell silent save for the crackle of the fire. At last, Colonel Harcourt sank heavily into a chair, his shoulders bowed. The fight had gone out of him. Miss Marple folded her hands once more, her expression serene. It is always the simplest things, is it not? A scrap of paper, a trembling hand, a flower laid with love. In villages,